Life of Mine Part 14. When we returned to our winter quarters, I tried to avoid allowing so lengthy an interval to elapse between the composition of the second and third acts as had separated that of the first and second. In spite of many absorbing engagements, I succeeded in my aim. By carefully cultivating a habit of taking solitary walks, and thanks to their soothing influence over me, I managed to finish the music of Act 3. By the 29th of December, that is to say, before the end of the year. During this period my time was otherwise very seriously occupied by a visit paid us by Spontini with reference to a proposed presentation of his Vestalin, the preparation for which had just begun. The singular episodes and characteristic features of the intercourse which I thus gained with this eminent and hoary-headed master are still so vividly imprinted on my memory that they seem worthy of a place in this record. Since, with the cooperation of Schroeder-Devrient, we could, on the whole, rely upon an admirable presentation of the opera, I had inspired Luttichow with the idea of inviting Spontini to undertake the personal superintendence of his justly famous work. He had just left Berlin forever, after enduring great humiliation there, and such an invitation at this moment would be a well-timed proof of respect. This was accordingly sent, and as I had myself been entrusted with the conductorship of the opera, I was given the singular task of deciding this point with the master. My letter, it appears, although written in French, inspired him with a high opinion of my zeal for the enterprise, and in a gracious reply he informed me what his special wishes were regarding the arrangements to be made for his collaboration. As far as the vocalists were concerned, and seeing that a Schroeder-Devrient was among the number, he frankly expressed his satisfaction. As for chorus and ballet, he took it for granted that nothing would be lacking to the dignity of the performance, and finally, as regarded the orchestra, he expected that this also would be sure to please him, as he presumed it contained the necessary complement of excellent instruments which, to use his own words, he hoped would furnish the performance with 12 good contrabasses. Le tout garni de 12 bons contrebasses. This phrase bowled me over, for the proportion thus bluntly stated in figures gave me so logical a conception of his exalted expectations, that I hurried away at once to the director to warn him that the enterprise on which we had embarked would not, after all, prove as easy as we thought. His alarm was great, and he said that some plan must at once be devised for breaking off the engagement. When Schroeder-Devrient heard of our dilemma, knowing Spontini well, she laughed as though she would never stop at the ingenuous impudence with which we had issued our invitation. A trifling indisposition from which she then suffered provided a reasonable excuse for a delay, more or less prolonged, and this she generously placed at our disposal. Spontini had, in fact, urged us to use all possible despatch in the execution of our project, for, as he was impatiently awaited in Paris, he could spare us but little time. It fell to my lot to weave the tissue of innocent deceptions by which we hoped to divert the master from a definite acceptance of our invitation. Now we could breathe again, and duly began rehearsing. But on the very day before we proposed to hold our full dress rehearsal at our leisure, lo and behold, about noon a carriage drove up to my door, in which, clad in a long blue coat of pilot cloth, sat no other than the haughty master himself, whose manners resembled those of a Spanish grandee. All unattended and greatly excited, he entered my room, showed me my letters, and proved from our correspondence that the invitation had not been declined, but that he had in all points accurately complied with our wishes. Forgetting for the moment all the possible embarrassments which might arise, in my genuine delight at beholding the wonderful man before me, and hearing his work conducted by himself, I at once undertook to do everything I possibly could to meet his desires. This declaration I made with the utmost sincerity of zeal. He smiled with almost childlike kindliness on hearing me, and I at once begged him to conduct the rehearsal arranged for the morrow. He thereupon grew suddenly thoughtful, and began to weigh the numerous disadvantages of such an action on his part. So acute did his agitation become that he had the greatest difficulty in expressing himself clearly on any point, and I found it no easy matter to inquire what arrangements on our part would persuade him to undertake the morrow's rehearsal. After a moment's reflection, he asked what sort of baton I was accustomed to use when conducting. With my hands I indicated the approximate length and thickness of a medium-sized wooden rod, such as our choir attendant was in the habit of supplying, freshly covered with white paper. He sighed, and asked if I thought it possible to procure him by tomorrow a baton of black ebony, whose very respectable length and thickness he indicated by a gesture, and on each end of which a fairly large knob of ivory was to be affixed. I promised to have one prepared for the next rehearsal, which should at least be similar in appearance to what he desired, and another of the specified materials in time for the actual performance. Visibly relieved, he then passed his hand over his brow, and granted me permission to announce his consent to conduct on the following day. After once more strongly enforcing his instructions as to the baton, he went back to his hotel. I seemed to be moving in a dream, and hastened in a whirlwind of excitement to publish the news of what had happened and was to be expected. We were fairly trapped. Schroeder Devrient offered to become our scapegoat, while I entered into precise details with the theatre carpenter concerning the baton. This turned out so far correct that it possessed the requisite length and breadth, was black in its color, and had 2 large white knobs. Then came the fateful rehearsal. Spontini was evidently ill at ease on his seat in the orchestra. First of all he wished to have the oboists placed behind him. As this partial change of position just at that moment would have caused much confusion in the disposition of the orchestra, I promised to effect the alteration after the rehearsal. He said no more, and took up his baton. In a moment I understood why he attached such importance to its form and size. He held it, not as other conductors do, by the end, but gripped it about the middle with his clenched fist, waving it so as to make it evident that he wielded his baton like a field marshal's staff, not for beating time, but for command. Confusion arose in the very first scene, which was increased by the fact that the master's instructions, both to orchestra and singers, were rendered almost unintelligible by his confused use of the German language. This much at least we were soon able to grasp, that he was particularly anxious to disabuse us of the idea that this was a full-dress rehearsal, and to show us that he was set upon a thorough re-study of the opera from the very beginning. Great, indeed, was the despair of my good old chorus master and stage manager, Fischer, who before had enthusiastically advocated the invitation of Spontini, when he recognized that the dislocation of our repertoire was now inevitable. This feeling swelled by degrees to open anger, in the blindness of which every fresh suggestion of Spontini's appeared but frivolous fault-finding, to which he bluntly responded in the coarsest German. After one of the choruses, Spontini beckoned me to his side and whispered, "My savez Vaus, vos curs any chantent par mal," whereupon Fischer, regarding this with suspicion, shouted out to me in a rage, "What does the old hog want now?" and I had some trouble to pacify the speedily converted enthusiast. But our most serious delay arose, during the first act, through the evolutions of a triumphal march. With the most vociferous emphasis, the master expressed intense dissatisfaction with the apathetic demeanor of our populace during the procession of Vestal Virgins. He was quite unaware of the fact that, in obedience to our stage manager's instructions, they had fallen on their knees upon the appearance of the priestesses, for he was so excited, and withal so terribly short-sighted, that nothing which appealed to the eye alone was perceptible to his senses. What he demanded was that the Roman army should manifest its devout respect in more drastic fashion by flinging themselves as one man to the ground, and marking this by delivering a crashing blow of their spears on their shields. Endless attempts were made, but someone always clattered either too soon or too late. Then he repeated the action himself several times with his baton on the desk, but all to no purpose. The crash was not sufficiently sharp and emphatic. This reminded me of the impression made upon me some years before in Berlin by the wonderful precision and almost alarming effect with which I had seen similar evolutions carried out in the play of Ferdinand Cortez, and I realized that it would require an immediate and tedious accentuation of our customary softness of action in such maneuvers before we could meet the fastidious master's requirements. At the end of the first act, Spontini went on the stage himself, in order to give a detailed explanation of his reasons for wishing to defer his opera for a considerable time, so as to prepare by multitudinous rehearsals for its production in accordance with his taste. He expected to find the actors of the Dresden Court Theatre gathered there to hear him, but the company had already dispersed. Singers and stage manager had hastily scattered in every direction to give vent, each in his own fashion, to the misery of the situation. None but the workmen, lamp cleaners, and a few of the chorus gathered in a semicircle around Spontini, in order to have a look at that remarkable man, as he held forth with wonderful effect on the requirements of true theatrical art. Turning towards the dismal scene, I gently and respectfully pointed out to Spontini the uselessness of his declamation, and promised that everything should eventually be done precisely as he desired. Finally, I succeeded in extricating him from the undignified position in which, to my horror, he had been placed, by telling him that Herr Eduard Devrient, who had seen the Vestalin in Berlin, and carried every detail of the performance in his mind, should personally drill our chorus and supers into a becoming solemnity during the reception of the Vestals. This pacified him, and we proceeded to settle on a plan for a series of rehearsals according to his wishes. But, in spite of all this, I was the only person to whom this strange turn of affairs was not unwelcome, for through the burlesque extravagances of Spontini, and notwithstanding his extraordinary eccentricities, which, however, I learned in time to understand, I could perceive the miraculous energy with which he pursued and attained an ideal of theatrical art such as in our days had become almost unknown. We began, therefore, with a pianoforte rehearsal, at which the master made a point of telling the singers what he wanted. He did not tell us anything new, however, for he said little about the details of the rendering. On the other hand, he expatiated upon the general interpretation, and I noticed that in doing this, he had accustomed himself to make the most decided allowances for the great singers, especially Schroeder Devrient and Tkachek. The only thing he did was to forbid the latter to use the word brought, bride, with which Licinius had to address Julia in the German translation. This word sounded horrible in his ears, and he could not understand how anybody could set such a vulgar sound as that to music. He gave a long lecture, however, to the somewhat coarse and less talented singer who took the part of the high priest, and explained to him how to understand and interpret this character from the dialogue, in recitative, between him and her Usbeks. He told him that he must understand that the whole thing was based upon priestcraft and superstition. Pontifex must make it clear that he does not fear his antagonist at the head of the Roman army, because, should the worst come to the worst, he has his machines ready, which, if necessary, will miraculously rekindle the dead fire of Vesta. In this way, even though Julia should escape the sacrifice, the power of the priesthood would still be unassailable. During one of the rehearsals I asked Spontini why he, who, as a rule, made such very effective use of the trombone, should have left it entirely out in the magnificent triumphal march of the first act. Very much astonished, he asked, "Ist sie que genere par de trombones?" I showed him the printed score, and he then asked me to add the trombones to the march, so that, if possible, they might be used at the next rehearsal. He also said, "Jari intendu dans votre rienzi un instrument, que vous appelez bass tuba. Jani vu par banni cet instrument de l'orchestre, faites-em in one partie pour la Vestale." It gave me great pleasure to perform this task for him with all the care and good judgment I could dispose of. When at the rehearsal he heard the effect for the first time, he threw me a really grateful glance, and so much appreciated the really simple additions I had made to his score, that a little later on he wrote me a very friendly letter from Paris in which he asked me kindly to send him the extra instrumental parts one had prepared for him. His pride would not allow him, however, to ask outright for something for which I alone had been responsible, so he wrote, Envoyez-moi une partition des trombones pour la marche triomphale et de la basse tuba telle qu'elle est exécutée sous ma direction à Dresde. Apart from this, I also showed how greatly I respected him, in the eagerness with which, at his special request, I regrouped all the instruments in the orchestra. He was forced to this request more by habit than by principle, and how very important it seemed to him not to make the slightest change in his customary arrangements was proved to me when he explained his method of conducting. He conducted the orchestra, so he said, only with his eyes. My left eye is the first violin, my right eye the second, and if the eye is to have power, one must not wear glasses, as so many bad conductors do, even if one is short-sighted. I, he admitted confidentially, cannot see 12 inches in front of me, but all the same I can make them play as I want, merely by fixing them with my eye. In some respects, the arbitrary way in which he used to arrange his orchestra was really very irrational. From his old days in Paris, he had retained the habit of placing the two oboists immediately behind him, and although this was a fad which owed its origin to a mere accident, it was one to which he always adhered. The consequence was that these players had to avert the mouthpiece of their instruments from the audience, and our excellent oboist was so angry about this arrangement that it was only by dint of great diplomacy that I succeeded in pacifying him. Apart from this, Spontini's method was based upon the absolutely correct system, which even at the present time is misunderstood by some German orchestras, of spreading the string quartet over the whole orchestra. This system further consisted in preventing the brass and percussion instruments from culminating in one point and drowning each other, by dividing them on both sides, and by placing the more delicate wind instruments at a judicious distance from each other, thus forming a chain between the violins. Even some great and celebrated orchestras of the present day still retain the custom of dividing the mass of instruments into two halves, the string and the wind instruments, an arrangement that denotes roughness and a lack of understanding of the sound of the orchestra, which ought to blend harmoniously and be well balanced. I was very glad to have the chance of introducing this excellent improvement in Dresden, for now that Spontini himself had initiated it, it was an easy matter to get the king's command to let the alteration stand. Nothing remained after Spontini's departure but to modify and correct certain eccentricities and arbitrary features in his arrangements, and from that moment I attained a high level of success with my orchestra. With all the peculiarities he showed at rehearsals, this exceptional man fascinated both musicians and singers to such an extent that the production attracted quite an unusual amount of attention. Very characteristic was the energy with which he insisted on exceptionally sharp rhythmic accents. Through his association with the Berlin Orchestra, he had acquired the habit of marking the note that he wished to be brought out with the word dies, this, which at first was quite incomprehensible to me. The great singer Tkachuk, who had a positive genius for rhythm, was highly pleased by this, for he also had acquired the habit of compelling the chorus to great precision in very important entries, and maintained that if one only accentuated the first note properly, the rest followed as a matter of course. On the whole, therefore, a spirit of devotion to the master gradually pervaded the orchestra. The violas alone bore him a grudge for a while, and for this reason. In the accompaniment of the lugubrious cantilena of Julia at the end of the second act, he would not put up with the way in which the violas played the horribly sentimental accompaniment. Suddenly turning towards them, he called in a sepulchral tone, "Are the violas dying?" The two pale and incurably melancholy old men who held on tenaciously to their posts in the orchestra, notwithstanding their right to a pension, stared at Spontini with real fright, reading a threat in his words, and I had to explain Spontini's wish in sober language in order to call them back to life. On the stage, Herr Edouard Devrient helped very materially in bringing about wonderfully distinct ensembles. He also knew how to gratify a certain wish of Spontini's, which threw us all into tremendous confusion. In accordance with the cuts adopted by all the German theatres, we too ended the opera with the fiery duet, supported by the chorus, between Licinius and Julia after their rescue. The master, however, insisted on adding a lively chorus and ballet to the finale, according to the antiquated method of ending common to French opera seria. He was absolutely against finishing his work with a dismal churchyard episode, consequently the whole scene had to be altered. Venus was to shine resplendent in a rose bower, and the long-suffering lovers were to be wedded at her altar, amid lively dancing and singing, by rose-bedecked priests and priestesses. We performed it like this, but unluckily not with the success we had all hoped for. In the course of the production, which was proceeding with wonderful accuracy and verve, we came across a difficulty with regard to the principal part for which none of us had been prepared. Our great Schröder-Devrient was obviously no longer of an age to give the desired effect as the youngest of the Vestal Virgins. She had acquired matronly contours, and her age was moreover accentuated by the extremely girlish-looking high priestess with whom she had to act, and whose youth it was difficult to dissimulate. This was my niece, Johanna Wagner, who, because of her marvelous voice and great talent as an actress, made everyone in the audience long to see the parts of the two women reversed. Schröder-Devrient, who was well aware of this fact, tried by every effective means in her power to overcome her most difficult position. This effort, however, resulted not infrequently in great exaggeration and straining of the voice, and in one very important place her part was sadly overacted. When, after the great trio in the second act, she had to gasp the words, ist frei, he is free, and to move away from her rescued lover towards the front of the stage, she made the mistake of speaking the words instead of singing them. She had often proved the effect of a decisive word uttered with an exaggerated and yet careful imitation of the ordinary accents of the spoken language, by exciting the audience's wildest enthusiasm when she almost whispered the words, Noch einen Schritt und du bist tot. Just one more step and thou art dead in Fidelia. This terrific effect, which I too had felt, was produced by the shock like unto the blow of an executioner's axe, which I received on suddenly coming down from the ideal sphere to which music itself can exalt the most awful situations, to the naked surface of dreadful reality. This sensation was due simply to the knowledge of the utmost height of the sublime, and the memory of the impression I received led me to call that particular moment the moment of lightning, for it was as if two different worlds that meet, and yet are divided, were suddenly illumined and revealed as by a flash. Thoroughly to understand such a moment, and not to treat it wrongly, was the whole secret, and this I fully realized on that day from the absolute failure on the great singer's part to produce the right effect. The toneless, hoarse way in which she uttered the words was like throwing cold water over the audience and myself, and not one of those present could see any more in the incident than a botched theatrical effect. It is possible that the public had expected too much, for they were curious to see spontaneous conduct, and the prices had been raised accordingly. It may also have been that the whole style of the work, with its antiquated French plot, seemed rather obsolete in spite of the majestic beauty of the music, or, perhaps, the very tame end left the same cold impression as Devrient dramatic failure. In any case there was no real enthusiasm, and the only sign of approval was a rather lukewarm call for the celebrated master, who, covered with numerous decorations, made a sad impression on me as he bowed his thanks to the audience for their very moderate applause. Nobody was less blind to the somewhat disappointing result than Spontini himself. He decided, however, to defy fate, and to this end had recourse to means which he had often employed in Berlin, in order to get packed houses for his operatic productions. Thus, he always gave Sunday performances, for experience had taught him that he could always have a full house on that day. As the next Sunday on which his Vestalin was to be produced was still some time ahead, his prolonged stay gave us several more chances of enjoying his interesting company. I have such a vivid recollection of the hours spent with him either at Madame Devrient's or at my house, that I shall be pleased to quote a few reminiscences. I shall never forget a dinner at Schroeder Devrient's house at which we had a charming conversation with Spontini and his wife, a sister of the celebrated pianoforte maker, Erard. Spontini generally listened deferentially to what the others had to say, his attitude being that of a man who expected to be asked for his opinion. When he did speak in the end it was with a sort of rhetorical solemnity, in sharp and precise sentences, categorical and well accentuated, which forbade contradiction from the outset. Herr Ferdinand Hiller was among the invited guests, and he began to speak about Liszt. After some time Spontini gave his opinion in his characteristic fashion, but in a spirit which showed only too clearly that from the heights of his Berlin throne he had not judged the affairs of the world either with impartiality or goodwill. While he was laying down the law in this style, he could not brook any interruption. When, therefore, during the dessert, The general conversation became livelier, and Madame Devrient happened to laugh with her neighbor at the table in the middle of a long harangue of Spontini's. He shot an extremely angry glance at his wife. Madame Devrient apologized for her at once by saying that it was she, Madame Devrient, who had been laughing about some lines on a bonbonnière, whereupon Spontini retorted, "Portant je suis ce que c'est ma femme qui a ce site ci rire. Je n'y vu pas qu'elle en rit devant moi. Je n'y ris jamais moi. J'aime le sérieux." In spite of that, he sometimes succeeded in being jovial. For instance, it amused him to set us all wondering at the way in which he crunched enormous lumps of sugar with his marvelous teeth. After dinner, when we drew our chairs closer together, he usually became very excited. As far as he was capable of affection, he seemed really to like me. He declared openly that he loved me, and said that he would prove this best by trying to keep me from the misfortune of proceeding in my career as a dramatic composer. He said he knew it would be difficult to convince me of the value of this friendly service, but as he felt it his sacred duty to look after my happiness in this particular line, he was prepared to stay in Dresden for another half-year, during which period he suggested that we should produce his other operas, and especially Agnes von Hohenstaufen, under his direction. To explain his views about the fatal mistake of trying to succeed as a dramatic composer after Spontini, he began by praising me in these terms: "Quand j'aurai entendu votre rienzi, j'aurai dit, c'est un homme de génie, mais déjà Illinois plus fait que Illinois n'y put faire." In order to show me what he meant by this paradox, he proceeded as follows: "Après Gluck c'est moi qui ai fait la grande révolution avec la Vestale. J'ai introduit le Vorhalt de la Sexte, the suspension of the sixth, dans l'harmonie at la grosse caisse dans l'orchestre. Avec Cortez j'ai fait un pas de plus en avant, puis j'ai fait trois pas avec Olympique. Nirmahal, Alcida at tout ce que j'ai fait dans les premiers temps à Berlin, j'ai vous les livres, si tient des over occasionnels, mais depuis j'ai fait cent pas en avant avec Agnes de Hohenstaufen, ou j'ai imagine un emploi de l'orchestre replicant parfaitement l'orgue. Since then he had tried his hand at a new work, Les Atheniennes. The Crown Prince, now King of Prussia, had urged him to finish this work, and to testify to the truth of his words, he took several letters which he had received from this monarch out of his pocketbook, and handed them to us for inspection. Not until he had insisted upon our reading them carefully through did he continue by saying that, in spite of this flattering invitation, he had given up the idea of setting this excellent subject to music, because he felt sure he could never surpass his Agnes von Hohenstaufen, nor invent anything new. In conclusion he said, "Or, comment voulez-vous que quiconque puisse inventer quelque chose de nouveau, moi Spontini déclarant any pouvoir en aucune fécond surpasse mis over précédence, d'autre part étant avise que depuis la Vestale Illinois n'a point écrit one note qui n'y fut volée de mis partitions." To prove that this assertion was not merely talk, but that it was based on scientific investigations, he quoted his wife, who was supposed to have read with him an elaborate discussion on the subject by a celebrated member of the French Academy, and he added that the essay in question had, for some mysterious reason, never been printed. In this very important and scientific treatise it was proved that without Spontini's invention of the suspension of the sixth in his Vestolin, the whole of modern melody would not have existed, and that any and every form of melody that had been used since had been borrowed from his compositions. I was thunderstruck, but hoped all the same to bring the inexorable master to a better frame of mind, especially in regard to certain reservations he had made. I acknowledged that the academician in question was right in many ways, but I asked him if he did not believe that if somebody brought him a dramatic poem full of an absolutely new and hitherto unknown spirit, it would not inspire him to invent new musical combinations. With a ring of compassion in his voice, he replied that my question was wholly mistaken. In what would the novelty consist? Dans la Vestale Jare compose un sujet roman, dans Ferdinand Cortés un sujet espagnol mexicain, dans Olympique un sujet greco-macedonian, enfin dans Agnes de Hohenstaufen un sujet allemand, tout le reste n'y vaut rien. He hoped that I was not thinking of the so-called romantic style à la Frischütz. With such childish stuff no serious man could have anything to do, for art was a serious thing, and he had exhausted serious art. And, after all, what nation could produce the composer who could surpass him? Surely not the Italians, whom he characterized simply as cochons, certainly not the French, who had only imitated the Italians, nor the Germans, who would never get beyond their childhood in music, and who, if they had ever possessed any talent, had had it all spoilt for them by the Jews. Oh, croyez moi, Illinois y avait de l'espoir pour l'Allemagne lorsque j'étais empereur de la musique à Berlin, mais depuis que le roi de Prusse livre sa musique et eu desordre occasion par les ducs juifs errants tu Illinois retires, tout espoir est perdu. Our charming hostess now thought it time to change the subject, and to divert the master's thoughts. The theatre was situated quite near to her house. She invited him to go across with our friend Heine, who was amongst the guests, and to have a look at Antigone, which was then being given, and which was sure to interest him on account of the antique equipment of the stage, which had been carried out according to Semper's excellent plans. At first he wanted to refuse, on the plea that he had seen all this so much better when his Olympia had been performed. After a while he consented, but in a very short time he returned to his original opinion, and, smiling scornfully, assured us that he had seen and heard enough to strengthen him in his verdict. Heine told us that shortly after he and Spontini had taken their seats in the almost empty amphitheatre, and as soon as the Bacchus chorus had started, Spontini had said to him, "C'est de la Berliner Sing Academy, allons now cien." Through an open door a streak of light had fallen on a lonely figure behind one of the columns. Heine had recognized Mendelssohn, and concluded that he had overheard Spontini's remark. From the master's very excited conversations we soon realized very distinctly that he intended to stay longer in Dresden, so as to get all his operas performed. It was Schroeder-Devrient idea to save Spontini, in his own interest, from the mortifying disappointment of finding all his enthusiastic hopes in regard to a second performance of Vestalin unfounded, and, if possible, to prevent this second performance during his stay in Dresden. She pretended to be ill, and the director requested me to inform Spontini of the fact that his production would have to be indefinitely postponed. This visit was so distasteful to me that I was glad to make it in Rockel's company. He was also a friend of Spontini's, and his French was moreover much better than mine. As we were quite prepared for a bad reception, we were really frightened to enter. Imagine, therefore, our astonishment when we found the master, who had already been informed of the news in a letter from Devrient, in the very brightest spirits. He told us that he had to leave immediately for Paris, and that from there he was to travel to Rome, the Holy Father having commanded him to come in order to receive the title of Count of San Andrea. Then he showed us a second document, in which the King of Denmark was supposed to have raised him to the Danish nobility. This meant, however, only that the title of Ritter of the Elefanten Order had been conferred upon him, and although this was indeed a high honor, in speaking about it he only mentioned the word Ritter without referring to the particular order, because this seemed to him too ordinary for a person of his dignity. He was, however, childishly pleased over the affair, and felt that he had been miraculously rescued from the narrow sphere of his Dresden Vestalin production to find himself suddenly transported into regions of glory, from which he looked down upon the distressing opera world with sublime self-content. Meanwhile Rockel and I silently thanked the Holy Father and the King of Denmark from the bottom of our hearts. We bade an affectionate farewell to the strange master, and to cheer him I promised him seriously to think over his friendly advice with regard to my career as a composer of opera. Later on I heard what Spontini had said about me, on hearing that I had fled from Dresden for political reasons, and had sought refuge in Switzerland. He thought that this was in consequence of my share in a plot of high treason against the King of Saxony, whom he looked upon as my benefactor, because I had been nominated conductor of the Royal Orchestra, and he expressed his opinion about me by ejaculating in tones of the deepest anguish, "Quelle ingratitude!" From Berlioz, who was at Spontini's deathbed until the end, I heard that the master had struggled most determinedly against death, and had cried repeatedly, "Je ne veux pas mourir, je ne veux pas mourir," when Berlioz tried to comfort him by saying, "Comment pouvez-vous penser mourir vous, mon maître, qui êtes immortel?" Spontini retorted angrily, "Any fates pas de mauvaises plaisanteries." In spite of all the extraordinary experiences I had had with him, the news of his death, which I received in Zurich, touched me very deeply. Later on I expressed my feelings towards him, and my opinion of him as an artist, in a somewhat condensed form in the Eidgenossischen Zeitung, and in this article the quality I extolled more particularly in him was that, unlike Meyerbeer, who was then the rage, and the very aged Rossini, he believed absolutely in himself and his art. All the same, and somewhat to my disgust, I could not but see that this belief in himself had deteriorated into a veritable superstition. I do not remember in those days having gone deeply into my feelings about Spontini's exceedingly strange individuality, nor do I recollect having troubled to discover how far they were consistent with the high opinion I formed of him after I had got to know him more intimately. Obviously, I had only seen the caricature of the man, although the tendency towards such plainly overweening self-confidence may, at all events, have manifested itself earlier in life. At the same time, one could trace in all this the influence of the decay of the musical and dramatic life of the period, which Spontini, situated as he was in Berlin, was well able to witness. The surprising fact that he saw his chief merit in unessential details showed plainly that his judgment had become childish. In my opinion, this did not detract from the great value of his works, however much he might exaggerate their value. In a sense, I could justify his boundless self-confidence, which was principally the outcome of the comparison between himself and the great composers who were now replacing him, for in my heart of hearts I shared the contempt which he felt for these artists, although I did not dare to say so openly. And thus it came about that, in spite of his many somewhat absurd idiosyncrasies, I learned during this meeting at Dresden to feel a deep sympathy for this man, the like of whom I was never again to meet. My next experiences of important musical celebrities of this age were of quite a different character. Amongst the more distinguished of these was Heinrich Marschner, who, as a very young man, had been nominated musical director of the Dresden Orchestra by Weber. After Weber's death, he seemed to have hoped that he would take his place entirely, and it was due less to the fact that his talent was still unknown than to his repellent manner that he was disappointed in his expectations. His wife, however, suddenly came into some money, and this windfall enabled him to devote all his energies to his work as composer of operas, without being obliged to fill any fixed post. During the wild days of my youth, Marschner lived in Leipzig, where his operas Der Vampir and Templer und Judin saw their first appearance. My sister Rosalie had once taken me to him in order to hear his opinion about me. He did not treat me uncivilly, but my visit led to nothing. I was also present at the first night of his opera Des Faulkners Braut, which however was not a success. Then he went to Hanover. His opera Hans Heiling, which was originally produced in Berlin, I heard for the first time in Würzburg. It showed vacillation in its tendency, and a decrease in constructive power. After that he produced several other operas, such as Das Schloss am Ätna and Der Babu, which never became popular. He was always neglected by the management at Dresden, as though they bore him some grudge, and only his Templer was played at all often. My colleague, Riesiger, had to conduct this opera, and as in his absence I always had to take his place, it also fell to my lot on one occasion to direct a performance of this work. This was during the time that I worked at my Tannhäuser. I remember that, although I had often conducted this opera before in Magdeburg, On this occasion the wild nature of the instrumentation and its lack of mastership affected me to such an extent that it literally made me ill, and as soon as he returned, therefore, I implored Rieseger at any cost to resume the leadership. On the other hand, immediately after my nomination I had started on the production of Hans Heiling, but merely for the sake of the artistic honor. The insufficient distribution of the parts, however, a difficulty which in those days could not be overcome, made a complete success impossible. In any case, though, the whole spirit of the work seemed to be terribly old-fashioned. I now heard that Marschner had finished another opera called Adolf von Nassau, and in a criticism of this work, of the genuineness of which I was unable to judge, particular stress was laid upon the patriotic and noble German atmosphere of this new creation. I did my best to make the Dresden Theatre take the initiative, and to urge Luttichow to secure this opera before it was produced elsewhere. Marschner, who did not seem to have been treated with particular consideration by the Hanoverian opera authorities, accepted the invitation with great joy, sent his score, and declared himself willing to come to Dresden for the first performance. Luttichow, however, was not anxious to see him take his place at the head of the orchestra, while I, also, was of the opinion that the too frequent appearance of outside conductors, even if it were for the purpose of conducting their own works, would not only lead to confusion, but might also fail to be as amusing and instructive as Spontini's visit had proved to be. It was therefore decided that I should conduct the new opera myself. And how I lived to regret it! The score arrived, to a weak plot by Carl Golmick. The composer of The Templar had written such superficial music, that the principal effect lay in a drinking song for a quartet, in which the German Rhine and German wine played the usual stereotyped part peculiar to such male quartets. I lost all courage, but we had to go on with it now, and all I could do was to try, by maintaining a grave bearing, to make the singers take an interest in their task. This, however, was not easy. To Tkachek and Mitterwurzer were assigned the two principal male parts. Being both eminently musical, they sang everything at first sight, and after each number looked up at me as if to say, "What do you think of it all?" I maintained that it was good German music. They must not allow themselves to get confused. But all they did was to stare at each other in amazement, not knowing what to make of me. Nevertheless, in the end they could not stand it any longer, and when they saw that I still retained my gravity, they burst into loud laughter, in which I could not help joining. I now had to take them into my confidence, and make them promise to follow my lead and pretend to be serious, for it was impossible to give up the opera at this stage. A Viennese colorature singer of the latest style, Madame Spatzer Gentiluomo, who came to us from Hanover, and on whose services Marschner greatly relied, was rather taken with her part chiefly because it gave her the chance of showing brilliancy. And, indeed, there was a finale in which my German master had actually tried to steal a march on Donizetti. The princess had been poisoned by a golden rose, a present from the wicked Bishop of Mainz, and had become delirious. Adolf von Nassau, with the Knights of the German Empire, swears vengeance, and, accompanied by the chorus, pours out his feelings in a stretta of such incredible vulgarity and amateurishness that Donizetti would have thrown it at the head of any of his pupils who had dared to compose such a thing. Marschner now arrived for the dress rehearsal. He was very pleased, and, without compelling me to fausset, he gave me sufficient opportunities for exercising my powers in the art of concealing my real thoughts. At all events, I must have succeeded fairly well, for he had every reason to think himself considerately and kindly treated by me. During the performance, the public behaved very much as the singers had done at the rehearsals. We had brought a stillborn child into the world. But Marschner was comforted by the fact that his drinking quartet was encored. This was reminiscent of one of Becker's songs, Sie sollen nicht haben, den freien deutschen Rhein, they shall not have it, our free German Rhine. After the performance, the composer was my guest at a supper party at which, I am sorry to say, the singers, who had had enough of it, would not attend. Herr Ferdinand Hiller had the presence of mind to insist, in his toast to Marschner, that whatever one might say, all stress must be laid on the German master and German art. Strangely enough, Marschner himself contradicted him by saying that there was something wrong with German operatic compositions, and that one ought to consider the singers and how to write more brilliantly for their voices than he had succeeded in doing up to the present. Highly gifted as Marschner was, there can be no doubt that the decline of his genius was due partly to a tendency which even in the aging master himself, as he frankly admitted, was effecting an important and most salutary change. In later years I met him once more in Paris at the time of my memorable production of Tannhäuser. I did not feel inclined to renew the old relations, for, to tell the truth, I wanted to spare myself the unpleasantness of witnessing the consequences of his change of views, of which we had seen the beginning in Dresden. I learned that he was in a state of almost helpless childishness, and that he was in the hands of a young and ambitious woman, who was trying to make a last attempt at conquering Paris for him. Among other puff paragraphs calculated to spread Marschner's glory, I read one which said that the Parisians must not believe that Wagner, was representative of German art. No, if only Marschner were given a hearing, it would be discovered that he was beyond a doubt better suited to the French taste than I could ever be. Marschner died before his wife had succeeded in establishing this point. Ferdinand Hiller, on the other hand, who was in Dresden, behaved in a very charming and friendly manner, particularly at this time. Meyerbeer also stayed in the same town from time to time, precisely why, nobody knew. Once he had rented a little house for the summer near the Pernaischer Schlag, and under a pretty tree in the garden of this place he had had a small piano installed, whereon, in this idyllic retreat, he worked at his Feldlager in Schlesien. He lived in great retirement, and I saw very little of him. Ferdinand Hiller, on the contrary, took a commanding position in the Dresden musical world insofar as this was not already monopolized by the Royal Orchestra and its masters, and for many years he worked hard for its success. Having a little private capital, he established himself comfortably amongst us, and was soon known as a delightful host, who kept a pleasant house, which, thanks to his wife's influence, was frequented by a numerous Polish colony. Frau Hiller was indeed an exceptional Jewish woman of Polish origin, and she was perhaps all the more exceptional seeing that she, in company with her husband, had been baptized a Protestant in Italy. Hiller began his career in Dresden with the production of his opera, Der Traum in der Christnacht. Since the unheard-of fact that Rienzi had been able to rouse the Dresden public to lasting enthusiasm, many an opera composer had felt himself drawn towards our Florence on the Elbe, of which Lorby once said that as soon as one entered it one felt bound to apologize because one found so many good things there which one promptly forgot the moment one departed. The composer of Der Traum in der Christnacht looked upon this work as a peculiarly German composition. Hiller had set to music a gruesome play by Raupusch, Der Müller und sein Kind, The Miller and His Child, in which father and daughter, within but a short space of time, both die of consumption. He declared that he had conceived the dialogue and the music of this opera in what he called the popular style, but this work met with the same fate as that which, according to Liszt, befell all his compositions. In spite of his undoubted musical merits, which even Rossini acknowledged, and whether he gave them in French in Paris or in Italian in Italy, it was his sad experience always to see his operas fail. In Germany he had tried the Mendelssohnian style, and had succeeded in composing an oratorio called Die Zerstörung Jerusalems, which luckily was not taken notice of by the moody theatre-going public, and which consequently received the unassailable reputation of being a solid German work. He also took Mendelssohn's place as director of the Leipzig Gewandhaus concerts when the latter was called to Berlin in the capacity of general director. Hiller's evil fortune still pursued him, however, and he was unable to retain his position, everybody being given to understand that it was because his wife was not sufficiently acknowledged as concert prima donna. Mendelssohn returned and made Hiller leave, and Hiller boasted of having quarreled with him. Dresden and the success of my Rienzi now weighed so much upon his mind that he naturally made another attempt to succeed as an opera composer. Owing to his great energy, and to his position as son of a rich banker, a special attraction even to the director of a court theatre, it happened that he induced them to put aside my poor friend Rockel's Farinelli, the production of which had been promised him, in favor of his, Hiller's, own work, Der Traum in der Christnacht. He was of the opinion that next to Riesiger and myself, a man of greater musical reputation than Rockel was needed. Luttichow, however, was quite content to have Riesiger and myself as celebrities, particularly as we got on so well together, and he remained deaf to Hiller's wishes. To me Der Traum in der Christnacht was a great nuisance. I had to conduct it a second time, and before an empty house. Hiller now saw that he had been wrong in not taking my advice before, and in not shortening the opera by one act and altering the end, and he now fancied that he was doing me a great favor by at last declaring himself ready to act on my suggestion in the event of another performance of his opera being possible. I really managed to have it played once more. This was, however, to be the last time, and Hiller, who had read my book of Tannhäuser, thought that I had a great advantage over him in writing my own words. He therefore made me promise to help him with the choice and writing of a subject for his next opera. Shortly afterwards Hiller was present at a performance of Rienzi, which was again given before a crowded and enthusiastic house. When, at the end of the second act, and after frantic recalls from the audience, I left the orchestra in a great state of excitement, Hiller, who was waiting for me in the passage, took the opportunity of adding to his very hasty congratulations, "Do give my Traum once more." I promised him laughingly to do this if I had the chance, but I cannot remember whether it came off or not. While he was waiting for the creation of an entirely new plot for his next opera, Hiller devoted himself to the study of chamber music, to which his large and well-furnished room lent itself most admirably. A beautiful and solemn event added to the seriousness of the mood in which I finished the music to Tannhäuser towards the end of the year, and neutralized the more superficial impressions made upon me by the stirring events above described. This was the removal of the remains of Carl Maria von Weber from London to Dresden in December 1844. As I have already said, a committee had for years been agitating for this removal. From information given by a certain traveller, it had become known that the insignificant coffin which contained Weber's ashes had been disposed of in such a careless way in a remote corner of St. Paul's, that it was feared it might soon become impossible to identify it. My energetic friend, Professor Lowe, whom I have already mentioned, had availed himself of this information in order to urge the Dresden Glee Club, which constituted his hobby, to take the matter in hand. The concert of male singers arranged to this end had been a fair success financially, and they now wanted to induce the theatre management to make similar efforts, when suddenly they met with serious opposition from this very quarter. The management of the Dresden Theatre told the committee that the king had religious scruples with regard to disturbing the peace of the dead. However much we felt inclined to doubt the genuineness of these reasons, nothing could be done, and I was next approached on the subject, in the hope that my influential position might lend weight to my appeal. I entered into the spirit of the enterprise with great fervor. I consented to be made president. Herr Hofrat Schultz, director of the Antiken Cabinet, who was a well-known authority on artistic matters, and another gentleman, a Christian banker, were also elected members of the committee, and the movement thus received fresh life. Prospectuses were sent round, exhaustive plans were made, and numerous meetings held. Here, again, I met with opposition on the part of my chief, Luttichow. If he could have done so, he would have forbidden me to move in the matter by making the most of the king's scruples referred to above. But he had had a warning not to pick a quarrel with me after his experience in the summer, when, contrary to his expectations, the music written by me to celebrate the king's arrival had found favor with the monarch. As his antipathy to the proceedings was not so very serious, Luttichow must have seen that even the direct opposition of His Majesty could not have prevented the enterprise from being carried out privately, and that, on the contrary, the court would cut a sorry figure if the Royal Court Theatre, to which Weber once belonged, should assume a hostile attitude. He therefore tried in a would-be friendly way to make me desist from furthering the cause, well knowing that, without me, the plan would fail. He tried to convince me that it would be wrong to pay this exaggerated honor to Weber's memory, whereas nobody thought of removing the ashes of Morlacchi from Italy, although the latter had given his services to the Royal Orchestra for a much longer period than Weber had done. What would be the consequence? By way of argument he said, suppose Rieseger died on his journey to some watering place, his wife would then be as much justified as was Frau von Weber, who had annoyed him quite enough already, in expecting her husband's dead body to be brought home with music and pomp. I tried to calm him, and if I did not succeed in making him see the difference between Rieseger and Weber, I managed to make him understand that the affair must take its course, as the Berlin Court Theatre had already announced a benefit performance to support our undertaking. Meyerbeer, to whom my committee had applied, was instrumental in bringing this about, and a performance of Euryanthe was actually given which yielded the handsome balance of 6,000 marks. A few theatres of lesser importance now followed our lead. The Dresden Court Theatre, therefore, could not hold back any longer, and as we now had a fairly large sum at the bank, we were able to cover the expenses of the removal, as well as the cost of an appropriate vault and monument. We even had a nucleus fund for a statue of Weber, which we were to fight for later on. The elder of the two sons of the immortal master travelled to London to fetch the remains of his father. He brought them by boat down the Elbe, and finally arrived at the Dresden landing stage, from whence they were to be conducted to German soil. This last journey of the remains was to take place at night. A solemn torchlight procession was to be formed, and I had undertaken to see to the funeral music. I arranged this from two motives out of Euryanthe, using that part of the music in the overture which relates to the vision of spirits. I introduced the cavatina from Euryanthe Higher Dichtem Quell, here near the source, which I left unaltered, except that I transposed it into B-flat major, and I finished the whole, as Weber finished his opera, by a return to the first sublime motive. I had orchestrated this symphonic piece, which was well suited to the purpose, for 8 chosen wind instruments, and notwithstanding the volume of sound, I had not forgotten softness and delicacy of instrumentation. I substituted the gruesome tremolo of the violas, which appears in that part of the overture adapted by me, by 20 muffled drums, and as a whole attained to such an exceedingly impressive effect, especially to us who were full of thoughts of Weber, that, even in the theatre where we rehearsed, Schroeder Devrient, who was present, and who had been an intimate friend of Weber's, was deeply moved. I had never carried out anything more in keeping with the character of the subject, and the procession through the town was equally impressive.